Hi, this is the first in a series of lectures about building capital budgeting models in Excel. So we'll start off with the basics, the theory behind the models, which is something, of course, that you should know, but just to remind ourselves, okay, about this. So the first thing is what is capital budgeting? Well, it's one of the major financial decisions that financial managers make within firms. So capital expenditures, essentially, anything that's capital is long-lived. Capital assets are long-lived assets, capital funds are long-term funds, and so on. And with capital expenditures, these are long-term or long-lived expenditures that the firm makes. They are probably the most important financial decisions that are made in the firm for three reasons. One is that they generally involve significant amounts of money. I mean, we're not just talking tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands. Sometimes they involve millions, hundreds of millions, sometimes even billions of dollars. The second reason is that these projects take a long time to generate their returns. So often at the beginning, they start off slowly, and then a lot of the major returns comes towards the ends, and this could be years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years down the road. And third, the reason why they're really important then is that they're irreversible. Essentially, once the decision is made, it's not something you can turn around in 2 years and say, "Oh, we made a bad decision. Let's go and do it." Okay. And so if you get this right, then the firm has a good chance of being very profitable or staying in business. But if you get this wrong, then no matter how efficient the firm is, really they're just being efficient at on a bad decision. So the process essentially by which a firm decides what capital expenditures to make, by which they identify and evaluate different capital investment alternatives. This process then is known as capital budgeting. Okay? Now, with capital budgeting, there are a bunch of different phases, but the very first phase usually involves estimating what the cash flows will be to these investment projects. So you have a capital investment project, and then the process is you estimate what the cash flows are over the course of years to this investment project. And then you discount those cash flows back today to find the present value of those cash flows, which will tell you essentially what the project is worth. The discount rate you use is very important, and so later on we'll get into what the proper discount rate is for different capital expenditure projects or capital budgeting analysis. But once you find the present value, you then compare it then to its cost, and then you get the net present value. And this then determines whether it costs more than it's worth or it's worth more than it costs. But the first stage then, and the most difficult stage, is often determining what the relevant cash flows are, the forecasting of the cash flows are. In capital budgeting, we call this then the cash flow analysis. This analysis will often involve coordination with the marketing department on what kind of sales can be generated, coordination with the engineering department and logistics departments on what kind of expenses there are, and so on. And it's important then that all people involved have the same assumptions, the same expectations, and so on. Okay. So in terms of relevant cash flows, there are two things to note. One is that the cash flows that are going to be used are after-tax cash flows. There's no point in using before-tax cash flows because the government is going to essentially take its taxes. There are capital budgeting techniques that use before-tax cash flows and adjust accordingly, but in this particular course, we're just going to focus on after-tax cash flows. The second aspect of cash flows that's important is the incremental cash flows. And with incremental cash flows, really sometimes this is called a with or without analysis in terms of what cash flows essentially are incremental. So you ask yourself then, with the project, what cash flows happen, and then you ask yourself, without the project, what cash flows would the firm have? And the difference between these two then is are your incremental cash flows. Okay, incremental cash flows. This is somewhat new to me, so not too bad. Okay, now that we know that though, we can let's move on. In finance, and particularly in capital budgeting analysis, we focus on cash flows rather than income or net profits. One reason, of course, is that net profits or income essentially doesn't necessarily mean cash flow. So sales, when you make sales, they don't always result in cash. Sometimes they result in accounts receivables. And so this is difficult to analyze because a firm can be generating, or a project can be generating a lot of sales, but if it's not generating any cash, it's not really making any money, you see. So we focus then on cash flows because that gives us the true economic picture. The other thing about profits is that there are a bunch of what are called non-cash expenses that are simply booked to reduce the taxable income, but actually don't use any cash. There's no cash outflow involved. So you have to take all of this into account when you are analyzing a project. So with capital budgeting, we use incremental cash flows. We use cash flows itself. We don't include non-cash items and so on. The formula then to determine what the net cash flows are is this formula here. Okay, it's the net income, and then we add in any non-cash expenses, and the big one, of course, is depreciation. So you add that back because you didn't spend it. And then, of course, if there are any increases in net working capital, you subtract that out. And the net working capital, by definition, then net working capital is the net working capital is the current assets minus current liabilities. Current assets minus current liabilities. That's net working capital. And so if your current asset goes up, for instance, if your account receivable goes up, it means then that the net income that was generated didn't result in any cash. It just resulted in an account receivables. And so you subtract that out. So from year to year, you look at what the net working capital is, if there's been a change in net working capital, and that's what this particular delta here is speaking about. If there's a change in that, then you subtract out any increase in net working capital, or you add back in any decrease in net working capital. For incremental cash flows, we've mentioned then it's what will happen without this project, what cash flows there are, and then we say, well, if the project is taken on, what cash flows are there, and that difference is the incremental cash flows and so on. When it comes to incremental cash flows, there are some things that you need to consider. The first is well, essentially there are some things you need to say, well, we'll include this and we won't include that. So theoretically, okay, when it comes to sunk costs, you don't include sunk costs. That is, if you have spent money already, say on a marketing analysis or a quality analysis or a prototype, if you spent the money already, then whether you take the project or not, you're not going to get the money back. So without the project, you spent the money. With the project, you spent the money. And so there's no difference. It's not an incremental cash flow. So it becomes what's called a sunk cost. I should mention this is something that a lot of people have a difficult time wrapping their head around. The idea that sunk costs should not be included, but this is important. Opportunity costs you do include, and that is, for instance, if you have a warehouse that you were renting out or you could have rented out, and by taking on this project, you now house your facility, your manufacturing facility, for instance, in the warehouse. Then the rent that you're giving up becomes an opportunity cost of taking this project. And so that is included then in the cash flows of the project. You include externalities like environmental cleanup costs, shipping and installation will be included. Particularly, they are included in the initial capital outlay, what's called the depreciation base. In inflation, you generally don't include inflation because that's captured in the discount rate. But from time to time, if the inflation is, if it's a specific price increase on the product and so on, then you would include those price increases, even though you don't include the sort of general inflation in the economy. Incremental finance costs, then things like fees to raise the money, you do include all of those. So in terms of the cash flow analysis, then there are 3 moments in time when you would check the cash flow analysis. So if you look at the timeline then looks sort of something like this. Okay. So this is sort of the timeline. At time 0, which is when the project starts, at time n, which is when the project ends, and then somewhere in between at time t, which is where the cash flows are. So you have all these different time periods here: time 1, time 2, and so on, and then time t and time n. So the first cash flow is what happens at time 0. And of course, you have the year-to-year operating cash flows, which are at time t. And then at the end, we look at what's called the terminal cash flow, okay, which is cash flow time n. And we see these are 3 different sort of sets of cash flows at different points in time. Okay. The initial cash flow then is the cash flow at the beginning of the project and so on. It includes the capital outlay. It also includes then any opportunity cost at the beginning. It includes then the change in net working capital that happens at the beginning. The operating year-to-year cash flows then are simply revenues minus expenses, and then they take into account then you take into account what the tax rates might be and so on. Okay. Yeah. And then the terminal cash flow is at the end of the project, the last year in the project. Now, the last year in the project will have the operating cash flow for that year, but then it'll have the terminal cash flows as well. And these terminal cash flows generally have 2 parts to them. One is a salvage value. If you can sell whatever is left of the project, you can sell that. And then if there's a recovery, say, of net working capital, then you recover that as well. I guess at this point, we say the net working capital usually the main one that you consider then is usually inventory. You might consider accounts receivable changes, but inventory is often the big one. And so if you sell off the inventory at the end, that gets included in the terminal cash flows. So in terms of the formulas, then we can say that this would be the formula for the initial outlay and so on. Well, here's our working example. So for our working example, we have this project. Essentially, it's the Au Naturel fertilizer packaging plant, and the firm is planning to introduce then a new product, and the new product then is a new what is this here? A new high content fertilizer, yeah, and it's called then full of it because it's full of minerals and vitamins. This new product is going to be offered on a 5-year basis. We assume after 5 years, then the competition will come in. There'll be generic manufacturers, and it will no longer be profitable to make it. So to produce this new product, you've discovered that you'll need new equipment. It'll cost you $150,000 for the new equipment, and then there'll be shipping and installation costs for another $20,000. And then, of course, you'll also need to increase inventory by $6,000. Based on your marketing research, you believe you can sell 25,000 bags of content in the first year at $9.50 a bag, and you can do this for the next 5 years, possibly increase each year by a certain amount, and we'll factor that into the analysis. Cost of the contents and bags, packaging and so on is $4.50 a bag. This will be your variable cost, and then there will be fixed costs each year of, say, $40,000. We assume then that the project will be 100% depreciated, and we're going to start off with a straight line depreciation, and then work with that. Right now, we'll assume a tax rate of 34%, and we'll get to what the discount rate is later. So, with this project in mind now, let's pull up our spreadsheet. And the template, of course, is on Blackboard, so you can pull it up from there. It's the Unity example, the capital budgeting solution. So here's the spreadsheet. We can see then that we have all the information in hand, the equipment cost, shipping and installation costs, and so on. And generally here, this will be our input section. We have divided the input section into 3 sections or 4. The first section deals with the capital investment outlays, capital investment costs, and so on. The second section are costs related to operating income. The third section then are what are called market numbers. These are things essentially that come from the market, like depreciation and the tax rate. And then the final section then are what are called decision variables. So these are, in some sense, control variables that the firm might have some control over. For instance, the discount rate. And here, for other, I guess what we'll include for other is we'll say, let's assume that the firm, for instance, has some control over what the economic life is. It knows that it's a 5-year projected economic life, but it could choose to run it for 1 more year or 2 more years, or it could stop it at 4 years. So the firm actually has the choice as to when to quit the sales and so on. So we'll put economic life then of this as one of our decision variables. So based on what we know from the example here, the PowerPoint slide, just example here, we can fill in then the information. And as a matter of good modeling, the range names that are used here is a legend that's created here to say what the range names are. And we've mentioned that if you're going to be using a cell or information in a cell more than once, if you're going to be referring to it more than once, it's always a good idea then to name it. That way it's easier to reference. It's also easier to remember where the reference comes from. We've started off by putting in a few. Here is equipment cost. So we'll call this then equip cost. And then the next one is shipping and installation. Ship, install. And remember, each time you name a cell, you have to hit enter, otherwise it doesn't stick here. Additional inventory, we could call this add inv. Oops, sorry, let's put that up here instead. Add inv. Additional inventory, and salvage value, we can call this then salvage, and hit here. And so what we'll do here is we would put then the add-in, and that's C7, and down here we put the salvage as C8. And as you name the cells, you can continue to add to the legends. Now the advantage of this is if you have an external user who is viewing the model, then this external user doesn't have to go into the name manager to check what the names are. It's right there in front of him. And this is particularly useful if the external user doesn't even know about the name manager. Okay, let's start filling in the information. So, equipment cost, I believe, was 150,000. Fill that in. Shipping and installation was 20,000. Fill that in. Additional inventory was 6,000 in the first year. We'll fill that in. Salvage value. Well, right now, I believe the salvage value says that it'll be essentially worthless on the books. So we'll take our salvage value for now to be 0. And this is our initial capital outlay. For our year 1 demand, we had that it could sell 25,000 units or bags of fertilizer in the beginning. Our annual demand growth, and this is if it's going to grow from year to year, then what would the growth be from year to year? Right now we're going to assume it's 0, so we'll place it at 0. The initial price you can sell it at is $9.50, so we'll place it there. Our variable cost is $4.50, and our fixed cost was 40,000. Yeah, so we put all that in. Our depreciation rate is a straight line depreciation, so right now we'll assume it's a straight line depreciation. And for the straight line depreciation, we could for straight line depreciation put in 20% since it's 5 years, but of course, since we've included economic life as a decision variable, then our depreciation rate for now for straight line would be 20%. So we'll start off by putting 20% for now. We're going to need to change that in the end, but let's start off with that. It's not showing the percentage. All right, so let's include that there. Okay, our tax rate was 34%. So for our decision variables here, our discount rate, we haven't decided on what that is. And for economic life, we said it's 5 years. So we'll make that then 5 years. And let's format this to essentially be 5 years. Okay, so with all of this in mind, then we need to then fill out our cash flow analysis. Note that year 0 in the cash flow analysis, there is no operating cash flows. It's just the initial cash outlay. So there are no sales, there are no expenses, and so on. It's just at the bottom what the initial cash outlay is down here. Then from year 1 to 5, that's when you have operating expenses. You may have a change in the net working capital, which would be essentially an additional capital outlay, or you may not, depending on the nature of the problem. So in year 0, let's delete this and let's make that a change. Let's make that a change in net working capital. So in year 0, our change in net working capital is 6,000, and of course we don't want to hard code it in, so we'll just put equal, and it's an expense minus our adding our inventory. Okay, so minus 6,000. Our capital expenditure in year 0, and this is our equipment cost plus our shipping and installation. No. And that essentially comes to a total of 170,000. And note that these come from these two cells that are here, 150 plus 170, and that's there. So our total cash flow then for year 0, we'll say, is equal to the sum, and we'll take it as the sum of all of this. That is, there's no operating cash flow here, so in fact this we can say is 0. So I'll take it away. And so that's for our initial cash outlay. For year 1, the sales then is, as you know, sales is really then just the number of units sold times the price per unit. That is, we'll take our sales, our cost of goods sold, and so on, and we'll put this essentially into our spreadsheet. So the sales in year 1, the number of units sold, and so we haven't filled out what all these are, so we'll just reference the sales for now here. Number of units sold times the price per unit, yes, and this then is our sales. Less cost of goods sold, and so the cost of goods sold is our number of units sold times our variable costs. So it'll be minus the number of units sold times the variable cost. Okay, so here we have our price times number of units sold. Here we have our variable cost times number of units sold. And the gross profit then is simply the difference between these two guys. That will be our gross profit. So we make a gross profit of 125,000. We subtract out our fixed costs, and our fixed cost then is over here. Subtract that out. And that's our fixed costs. And we subtract out depreciation. Now, so far we don't have depreciation. So right now we need to go and create then a depreciation schedule. So let's do this off to the side. I believe it's already been partially set up to do so. So we'll do this then off to the side here. So here we have our supplemental calculations. The first supplemental calculation is our depreciation, and then the next supplemental calculation is our change in net working capital. Let's make some adjustments to this so it's more informative in the way it's set out. Our depreciation. And then over here, we'll our equipment cost. I'm not sure we need that. Ending UCC and UCC tax recovery. So we might include those. We might include this guy here, and for our and so we might need that here. Our equipment, we don't really need this, so we'll just move this here. And over here then, this is our net working capital. So that's our net working capital. So these are our two calculations, our depreciation and our net working capital. For depreciation, we have then our depreciation base, and our depreciation base is what we saw at the beginning. It's the equipment cost plus our shipping and installation. Okay, which is 170. And so in year 0, of course, then there's no additional amount that's there. But then in year 1, we can say our ending UCC in year 0 is that. In year 1, then this will be equal to our beginning UCC. So let's delete all this and essentially start from scratch. And so we have our shipping and installation costs there. Our ending UCC in year 0 is what we started off with there. And so our beginning UCC, and of course UCC stands for the undepreciated cost of capital. It's after depreciation has been taken off what's left. So at the beginning of year 1, it's really then what was at the end of year 0. Our depreciation, and for straight line depreciation, it's going to be equal to this Z4, our depreciation base, essentially, F4, then divided by our economic life. And our economic life is over here, so divided by that. And so that's 34. And so at the end of year 1, our undepreciated cost of capital is the difference then between those two guys at the end of year 1. So, and now that we have that for year 1, we can really just drag all the formulas across to the end. And so now we have our depreciation schedule. Here in for the net working capital, we start off with 6,000, which is our, well, let's, as we said, let's delete all this and start from scratch. It's essentially our additional inventory. And the change in net working capital here is going to be equal to, well, for now it's going to be equal to this. And then our net working capital hasn't changed. It's always going to be this here. So we can copy that across. And our change is going to be equal to here, minus the 2. And so that doesn't change. So all of this is our change in net working capital for year 0, year 1, year 2, year 3. So these are essentially this is most of the information that we need. We need the information here, and we need the information for depreciation rates here. These are the two sets then that will go into our cash flow analysis. So let's go back to the cash flow analysis. So for depreciation, we'll then take our year 1 depreciation, which is minus what we had just calculated for year 1, 34, and we put that in. And our EBIT, which is our so-called operating income, is then equal to our gross profit. Well, in fact, we can again use the sum function since these have gone in as negative. And so our operating income or earnings before interest and taxes then is 51,000. Less taxes, and so our taxes then is minus our operating income times our tax rate, and the tax rate then is 34%. So we have that, and our net income is the sum then of these guys. You add back in depreciation, so you add back in our depreciation from here. So note that depreciation is negative here, so we use negative, and that's positive. So we add this back in, and our cash flows then is our net income plus depreciation. This gives us essentially our operating cash flows, and our total cash flows then is our operating cash flows less any change in net working capital or less any capital expenditure. This is 0, and for this we will put negative this amount that's here, which is our change, and so we have that there. So we copy this formula here because this formula sums from here to here, and that's really what you want. So we copy this formula then over to here, and we end up then with our cash flow for year 1. at 67,660.